Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Casual Criminalist. Today we're covering the Apartheid Killer. Gonna guess this one takes place in South Africa then. Also the fact that it's written by Emma from South Africa. There we go, that's how it's gonna work. P.S. This is part one of a two-part series called The Murderous Van Schoors. Alright, I didn't even know we were doing series. Fair enough. I mean, I just read the scripts, don't I? That's all I do, that's my job. Come in, read scripts, go home. Let's crack on. When I was born, apartheid was taking its last dying breaths. Siri, when did apartheid end?
After years of often violent protest, the end of apartheid began in the early 1990s, culminating with the formation of a democratic South African
Alright,
government in
shut up.
1994.
I'm not polite to Siri like I am to ChatGPT. ChatGPT's smart. ChatGPT will come for me and my job and my life. Siri is just like an annoying child. Oh no, he's still listening. I'm sorry, Siri. As such, I can't really say what life was like under the apartheid regime, but I do know that apartheid was the result of over 300 years of systemized racism. I know that the ANC and their allies fought back by staging a number of bombing attacks that targeted white businesses and killed dozens of people. I know the members of the secret police were tasked with the capture, torture, and murder of anyone the apartheid regime considered to be a threat. And I know that casual violence against black South Africans was an everyday occurrence. That being said, today's case is going to be a little different than the cases we usually cover on the Casual Criminalist. The story is relatively unknown. There isn't a detailed list of known victims that's readily available. While investigating the murders, the police did the bare minimum, and most this is one of the things that rubs me most wrong in Casual Criminalist. It's like when the police are just and lazy and they're just like, hey, it's just another sex worker. It's fine. I mean, they get murdered all the time. Or I guess in this case, it's just another black guy in apartheid South Africa. Of course he's going to get murdered. Why would we look into that? And most of the case files relating to the murders have been lost. In some cases, the killer stood right next to the police while they were loading up the bodies of his victims, and the public viewed his actions as justified and treated him like a hero. Oh, he was supported by a judicial system that saw nothing wrong with what he was doing, and all of it combined enabled him to become one of South Africa's most controversial serial killers. When the fuck is a serial killer hailed as a hero? This is the story of Louis van Schoor, the Apartheid Killer. An Afrikaner at heart. It's difficult to explain how Louis van Schoor became a serial killer without providing you with a short history lesson on how apartheid came to be. And do note I started writing this script before Donald Trump wrote that insane executive order inviting Afrikaner refugees to move to the US, so hopefully this will help you better understand exactly what an Afrikaner is and why I've never identified as one despite being both white and Afrikaans. I have no idea what an Afrikaner is. I had no idea that Trump signed an executive order inviting Afrikaner refugees. I'm going to assume an Afrikaner is someone who is white South African and speaks Afrikaans, is my guess. South Africa was originally colonized by the Dutch in 1665. 20 years later, they were joined by the French Huguenots, or Protestants, who were fleeing religious persecution in France. They were joined by people from all over Europe and Asia, and when the Cape Colony officially became a British territory in 1814, its population was about as colourful as it is today and was ruled over by Dutch-speaking elites. However, the first native laws were already in place, and they dictated that black South Africans weren't allowed to enter the colony unless they were employed by a white master. During this time, the white farmers who lived on the outskirts of the colony regularly fought in skirmishes against both the Khoikhoi and the Kosher tribes, who quite rightly felt that the colony was encroaching on their land, which led to several small wars between the farmers and the local tribes. Yeah, you'd be a bit pissed off, wouldn't you? It's like some dude... Can you imagine you're just chilling in your garden and some dude turns up and he's like, that's mine now. And it's like, says who? And he says my laser pistol that you don't have. And you'll be like, alright, yeah, I guess... The laser pistol because you in your house and stuff, you've got a gun or whatever these days, but someone just shows up with like more technology and disease and shit and is just like, oh, sorry, that garden's mine. I like the look of that garden. In response to the constant threat, the farmers established small military groups referred to as commandos to help protect their farms, and they were also known to hunt down groups of black tribesmen who they suspected of having stolen their livestock, which often led to casualties on both sides. After the British took over the Cape Colony in 1814, they scrapped Dutch as the official language and replaced it with English instead, raised the taxes these farmers had to pay, and then had the gall to abolish slavery as well. God damn British. Abolishing slavery? What are you thinking? The gall! So just 20 years after the British took over, groups of Dutch-speaking farmers, aka the Boers. Every time, I'm never sure of the pronunciation on this, because I've looked it up so many times, I can never remember which one is correct. It's Boers, right? B-O... how do you spell it? B-O-E? Boers? Boers? Something like that. B-O-E-R-S. Boers. Oh, okay. Okay, that's why. And we got Boer War.
Also American Boer.
Boer. Yeah, I okay, now I remember people having to go at me. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's Boer. And the Americans are like, no, it's Boer. And I'm like, the Dutch person even is saying it like the English man. Boer. 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 Like a boa constrictor, yes! AKA, the Boers decided that they'd had enough of being treated as second-rate citizens in their own colony and started to move deeper inland so that they could establish two colonies of their own, the South African Republic, or ZAR. The Z stands for Zuid, Simon, since you were too lazy to look it up last time. No, I don't even remember that, but great. Thank you. And the Orange Free State. Of course, the Dutch are obsessed with orange. I can't remember why, but they are. Along the way, a group of these farmers were involved in a bloody war against the Zulu kingdom that did nothing to help future race relations, and by the time the two new Boer colonies were established, they resented not only the snobby British, but all black South Africans as well. By the time the first Boer War took place in 1880, the ZAR, this is ZAR, but I don't know, it's the same as the currency, right? The South African Rand is the ZAR, and I always call it ZAR in my mind, so that's what I'm going to go for. If it's ZAR, I apologize. The ZAR and the Orange Free State were already well on their way to becoming separatist states. Outlanders, aka Europeans who were fresh off the boat, weren't particularly welcome there, and there were stringent measures in place to keep them from becoming permanent citizens of the two Boer states. Black South Africans were considered to be uneducated barbarians and thieves who were only good for doing the back-breaking labour that their white masters didn't want to do. And Indian and Chinese labourers also weren't allowed to settle down in the two Boer states since they were seen as untrustworthy heathens. Then the Second Boer War broke out, and for a while there, the Boer commandos were wiping the floor with the British Army. These were men and boys who'd hunted elephants, rhinos, buffalo, and antelope, who'd defended their livestock against leopards and lions and cattle thieves since they were old enough to hold a gun, and they were expert marksmen and skilled horse riders. The British Army, on the other hand, were used to battles where they could face off with their enemy and then blast them away with their superior skills and weaponry. But the Boer commandos relied on stealth and employed guerrilla tactics that threw the British Army for a loop, and it soon became clear that if the British wanted to stop the Boer commandos, they had to cut them down at their knees. In March 1901, the British started actively hunting down these commandos and sending them off to prisoner of war camps. They also employed a scorched earth policy to keep the Boer commandos from being able to access much-needed supplies, such as food or medicine. Yeah, the British adjusted their tactics. They were like, okay, so we're not fighting a regular war. We're fighting literally was just mentioned. Use your brain, Simon. Not an insurgency. Oh, what's that bloody word? In Vietnam, the North Vietnamese were... God damn it, how could I not remember this? I literally just read it. What's wrong with my brain? Guerrilla. Guerrilla war, of course. So they've adjusted. They're fighting a guerrilla war, so they're adjusting their tactics to match. This meant that the British soldiers would raid farms and villages of black tribes, kill all the animals, and then reduce the farms and villages to ash. The women, children, and elderly were then taken to various concentration camps where they would remain until the war ended in 1902. During that time, an estimated 154,000 people were imprisoned in these camps, which made up 70% of the white population of the Boer republics at the time. Ah, damn. They imprisoned 70%? Of this Boer population, at least the white people, which is the majority, right? Holy shit. Between March 1901 and May 1902, 28,000 white South Africans and at least 20,000 black South Africans died in these concentration camps from starvation and diseases such as measles, typhoid, and dysentery, effectively wiping out more than 12% of the white population of the Boer states. That is crazy. When the Boers returned home after the war, they had to start rebuilding their lives from scratch, which put them at a significant disadvantage compared to their new British-born countrymen, and out of this economic turmoil, the Afrikaner was born. They were a fiercely proud and God-fearing people who hated the British, and just like the Nazis would do a few years later, they believed that the white Afrikaner Volk and traditions should be prioritized above all others, and that, quote, the destiny of the Volk was to rule South Africa. Okay. Afrikaner nationalists steadfastly believed that, as an ethnic minority, they could not allow black society to develop to the extent that they became capable of taking control of South Africa and subjugating the Afrikaners once more. Wait, why? Is it... I'm asking in my mind, wait, why do you think that as a minority, you should be the ones ruling? Like, why? And it's like, because they're white, they think they're better. It's the past. And not even the past that long ago in South Africa. 1990s? Holy South Africa. The National Party was established in 1914 to promote the interests of the Afrikaans-speaking citizens of South Africa, and when they came to power in 1948, they implemented the apartheid laws to ensure that no black child would ever be in a position where they could aspire to be better than their white counterparts. This is the world that Louis van Schoor was born into. Louis was born in a town called East London in 1951, and, as was tradition, he was saddled with a list of inherited family names. Holy... In this case, Sybrand Jacobus Lodwicus van Schoor. Okay. His father was a typical Afrikaner, stoic, strict and domineering. His word was law, and Louis and his siblings would be brutally punished whenever they put a foot out of line. According to Louis, quote, I was taught from a young age, you don't lie, you don't steal, and you don't bugger around with another man's wife. All right. It's very specific from a young age. It's like, no marital infidelity. It's like, Dad, I'm 7. According to John Stoltz, who would become Louis's spiritual advisor later on in life, Louis was spoon-fed racism with his cornflakes and grew up with a need to please his hard-hearted father. In the BBC Africa documentary, The Apartheid Killer, his daughter Sabrina explains that, quote, his family, his friends, the people he worked for, they weren't raised to see a black person as a human being. It's the same with Hitler, the Nazis. They indoctrinated the children from a young age. If your skin was dark, you're a criminal. Just right, this is the 1950s. This ain't some, 19th century shit. This is the 1950s. By the time he was a teenager, Louis had developed an inferiority complex that led him to always want to show that he was a real man, and it was a personality trait that would stick with him for the rest of his life. I'm surprised he developed an inferiority complex. I'm more surprised that he didn't develop the douchebag complex of being like, I'm better than everyone because of my skin color. Look how awesome I am. Shining pale and white. Someone's going to clip that. Jesus Christ. By the time Louis turned 16, the apartheid laws had already been in place for 20 years. Just 2 years earlier, the then president of South Africa and the man known as the architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, had been assassinated during a session of parliament, and tensions between the different races were running high. According to Louis, the blacks were trying to intimidate the whites. And yes, there was fear. Tension was brewing. The whites could read the writing on the wall, that the blacks were going to become a part of society. It was something we had to accept and live with, which I think 99% of your white population couldn't accept. They had fear. Louis left school at the end of that year and joined the police force. At the time, the police were mostly used to enforcing the apartheid laws, and they could be brutal about it. They were often sent out to help control riots and protests in the black townships, and were allowed to shoot the protesters with live rounds if and when they felt threatened. That sounds like a license to kill. It's like, oh, he came at me, that's why I shot him dead. And his family. They all came at me. They also conducted midnight raids in the townships, arrested people for no reason, and tortured them for information on anti-apartheid movements like the ANC and their military wing. According to Louis, it was drilled into us that we were protecting our country, and that's how we saw it. In 1966, a war broke out between South Africa and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, who wanted independence from the apartheid state. They were backed by the Soviet Union, Egypt, Algeria, North Korea, and the People's Republic of China, and initially, members of the South African police force were sent to defend Namibia's northern borders against the communist threat. Louis would end up volunteering to go and fight on the border for 3 months at a time, and when he returned to East London, he joined the infamous dog squad of the police force. According to an article by Sandra Swart titled Apartheid's Hounds, How South Africa Invented the World's Most Terrifying Police Dog, quote, police dogs were increasingly used in political crowd control, trained to attack, and specifically to attack Africans. The dogs became a living, snarling display of the power of the state. There are scores of such cases of brutality, with the Truth and Reconciliation files showing that dogs were also used for interrogation and torture. The hounds of apartheid had become an instrument, the iron fist of the white supremacist state. Now, we've all seen how attack dogs are trained. They're ordered to attack heavily padded humans, who are then jerked around like oversized chew toys. Yeah, attack dogs are real scary. Like, they will kill you, dude. They'll, bite your neck. But this was the apartheid era, and the dog squad had a more effective way of training their dogs by giving them a taste of blood. They would train their German shepherds by having them attack unarmed black people. In one of the clips I saw, 3 black men are barefoot and dressed in torn t-shirts and jeans, and you can hear them scream and beg for mercy as the dogs viciously rip into their arms and legs. The fact that this is happening when it could be caught on video is the fact that it happens is crazy, but the fact that this is happening in a modern enough time to be captured on video that you can now get on the internet is just wild. And I know horrible goes on all the time, but it seems so backward. In the background, you can hear the white policeman laugh and cheer while a terrified black woman cries. And Lewis told the BBC that, quote, "Later, I heard that the blacks were more scared of the dogs than they were of a gun." Lewis and his squad mates would unleash their dogs on black protesters during riots or use their dogs to hunt down black suspects while they were busy investigating a crime. Lewis would later explain that he remembered his time in the dog squad as some of the best years of his life. You psycho. And he chuckled as he described working with the dogs as like hunting, but a different species. No. It's like hunting, but the same species. Lewis married his first wife when he was in his early 20s, and his hobbies included running cross-country races barefoot, playing rugby for the police's rugby team, competing as part of the Eastern Cape's tug-of-war squad, competing in 4x4 drive challenges with his Land Rover, and training guard dogs for his friends and neighbors. Dude, I don't know, man. You sound like a psycho, running cross-country races barefoot. That's some psycho behavior. Like people who walk around without shoes. I saw some dude just walking around without shoes the other day, just like a regular dude. But he's not wearing shoes and his feet were all disgusting. And I'm like, what the why? Why, dude? I didn't ask him that. I did wonder. And it's not the first time I've seen just someone walking around without shoes, like a psycho. Lewis is described as being a real man's man, who always wore a gun holster at his hip and enjoyed drinking beer and socializing with his friends. Like a dude. He was tall and well-built, had dark, almost black hair, a bushy beard, and clear blue eyes. He also milked the fact that he was both a policeman and a soldier for all that it was worth, because as the saying goes, the ladies love a man in uniform. However, a local newspaper would later explain that Van Schoor is a self-imposed loner, flippantly extrovert on the surface but guarded on the inside. People who know him speak of him more as a subject than a person. Bro, that is so psycho. I also, I get the vibe though. I feel like I'm quite extroverted on the surface, but inside, it's just I can do extroversion, but I don't know, I've never felt like I fall on that either side of that. It's I can do extroversion, but it's hard work. Does that make sense? Lewis was generally well-liked in his community, but he wasn't as good at being a husband. He divorced his first wife when he was around 25 years old, and by the time he was 40, he'd already been married 4 times. Dude, maybe marriage ain't for you. Lewis met his second wife, Beverly, at a local church. She had been married at the time and had 3 sons with her husband. According to one of his friends, Lewis would invite Beverly's husband out to go fishing with him, and after the husband fell asleep, Lewis would drive back into town and go to keep Beverly company. That is so psycho. Why? Fine, have an affair or whatever. But why drive the husband out and go fishing with him, dude? That's psycho. Remember how Lewis talked about being taught not to bugger another man's wife? Well, it looks like he completely forgot to honor that part of his upbringing. Beverly eventually divorced her husband and got married to the now 27-year-old Lewis in 1978. Oh, that's not going to work well. He's got 2 more marriages and divorces after you, Bevs. Beverly, her 3 sons, and Lewis moved to a farm outside of East London, and a year later their daughter Sabrina was born. Lewis's stepsons would later explain that they got along just fine with Lewis. He was firm and strict, but he played with them and spent time with them, and generally, he was a good father to them. That kind of surprised me. He seems like a psycho. I guess you could be a psycho and be a good father, I suppose. Not mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, Lewis was fast approaching his 12th anniversary in the police force, but despite his best efforts, he hadn't been promoted past constable. According to one of his old colleagues, He was not a clever bloke, but he would go to hell and back to get his man. It was his way of proving that he was as good as the others. So, in 1980, Louis left the police force and claimed that it was because he was sick of being sent off to fight in the border war, but Beverly would confide in her friends that she'd found out that he was cheating on her and she wanted him closer to home, where she could keep an eye on him. Oh yeah, that's going to work out well, because keeping an eye on the husband who cheats definitely going to stop that cheating and not make him more sly. Come on, Beverly. Beverly then got him a job working as a salesman at a company that sold carpets, but according to Heidi Holland, the author of the book Color of Murder, quote, it proved too mundane of an occupation for a man who not only was attracted to danger, but also who enjoyed the adulation bestowed by whites on policemen and soldiers with dangerous reputations. Louis didn't stay there long and tried to reapply to join the police, but when his application was denied, Louis got a call from one of his old superiors, a Major C.J.H. Cluter. Major Cluter had recently opened a private security firm called Falcon Security. It's like a comic book name for a security company, and explained that he needed someone who had some experience to help him manage the company. Back in the day, security firms would install silent alarms in businesses and homes, and if the alarms were triggered, the police would be notified, and they'd then investigate the disturbance. But in the late 70s, the police started complaining that it was taking up too much of their time, so people like Major Cluter and Louis van Schoor filled the gaps and would go and investigate these disturbances themselves. According to Major Cluter, we did this work because it paid well. Yeah, private security does, I imagine. Like if you're like, don't mercenaries, like Blackwater and all that like once you've been in the military and you're looking for an opportunity outside in the civilian world, it's like they pay pretty. It's a good way to use your skills, right? To make some money. If I suppose you're a little bit morally flexible. Because those guys are always doing some weird, aren't they? Allegedly. Falcon Security had clients all over East London, and Louis would spend his days and nights patrolling the streets and responding to calls whenever they came in. He was usually dressed in just a t-shirt and a pair of shorts and would sneak into the buildings on bare feet. Dude, he loves his bare feet, doesn't he? I'll just be like, I'm just going to get hurt. There's going to be like a needle on the ground or something, and I'm going to get like AIDS. He carried a torch, a walkie-talkie, and a 9mm handgun, which was loaded with dum-dum bullets. These aren't legal, in America at least, right? Only the police get them. Because dum-dums are the ones that explode once they're inside, right? So, like, if the police shoot at someone, it's not just going to go straight through them and kill someone who's standing behind. But then also, like, that's not going to be good for your insides. Maybe this is completely wrong. Maybe that's not what a dum-dum is. Oh, these were bullets that have been designed to expand on impact and are similar to hollow point bullets. Okay, there we go. That's right. Louis took his new job very seriously, and people would later compliment him on the fact that he never seemed to sleep since he was always on patrol, night or day. Sabrina would later explain that she used to be close to her dad, but that kind of faded more into the background after he started working for Falcon Security. Also, some time has passed. This was his new daughter, right? My father wasn't there. I would see him for 1 or 2 hours, and then he would leave. Because Louis now spent... Well, I mean, wait, is that on the weekends as well? I guess, I don't know, like I'd probably see my kids for 1 or 2 hours a day. Because, I don't know, get up in the morning, go to work. I drive them to school, I suppose, which is quite a bit of time. And then I see them in the evening. But I guess I spend like all weekend with them, so that's nice. Because Louis now spent most of his time patrolling the streets of East London, his marriage to Beverly collapsed and they were divorced in 1983. Beverly took her 3 boys and the 4-year-old Sabrina and moved to Queenstown. She'd later explained that Louis had been abusive towards her and had threatened to kill her, and that after their divorce, she had to rebuild their lives from scratch. According to Beverly, Louis also didn't pay child support, so she did her best to keep Sabrina away from him. According to Sabrina, seeing as we no longer had a father to look after us, my mum took his place and proved to be a much better father in the long run. I just had to adapt to it all. Louis enjoyed his time at Falcon Security and quickly made a name for himself. This soon led to the company receiving bigger and more lucrative contracts, and within a year, Louis the security guard became a bit of a legend around town. Well, I think it was more. Wasn't he asked to help manage the show? But he's just a security guard? That is until rumours started to spread around East London that a bearded white man was stalking black men after dark, and that more and more of them were going missing every day. Bospafok. P.S. Xhosa, the main language spoken in the Eastern Cape, is also one of the most difficult languages to pronounce. So, Mzansi, please don't fault time for not being able to pronounce the Xhosa names like a local. Oh my, yeah, no. Do we need to include a disclaimer about my pronunciation these days? I'm not the best at it. My mother-in-law's partner uncle Johan is the same age as Louis, and just like Louis, he'd joined the police force when he was young and spent several months fighting on the border. And when I told him about Louis's crimes, Uncle Johan's face fell with disappointment and he shook his head and said, "Louis was Bosbefok." My dad is also a veteran of the border wars, and he explained that being Bosbefok was a form of PTSD. Basically, the soldiers would spend 2 years following rigid guidelines. They were sent to destroy rebel camps and kill all the occupants. They saw their friends die, and then had to return to civilized society like nothing had happened. My dad explained that some of the men struggled to adapt, and the ones who lashed out by defying society's rules and often going a little gun crazy would be described as Bosbefok. Okay, so it's like, PTSD or shell shock. Probably closer to shell shock, right? Like how we used to describe it before we understood what was going on. He also concluded that it probably didn't help that Louis would return from the border after a few months and would then continue to work in an environment where he was expected to be violent toward others. Louis's daughter, Sabrina, would tell the BBC that her father seemed to lack empathy, that he could come across as being cruel and unfeeling, and that it's entirely possible that by the time he left the police force, he wasn't a stranger to killing others. Major Cluter would later tell Heidi Holland that when it hired Louis to work for him, quote, "I knew Van Schoor was the kind of bloke that liked to use his firearm. He had shot 2 black men dead at that stage. That I know because I killed one and he used to say, 'Ha, I'm ahead of you.'" In or around April 1989, 6 years after Louis had started working for Falcon Security, an estate agent in East London named Desmond Nish contacted a local newspaper called the Daily Dispatch and spoke to a journalist named Andrew Austin. Nish explained that he had received a call from a representative of Falcon Security who'd tried to sell him a burglar alarm. The salesman then went on to brag about just how effective one of their security guards was and claimed that Louis van Schoor has killed or wounded up to 100 burglars. It's kind of a psycho selling point, isn't it? Nish told Andrew Austin that he knew it sounded just like another sales pitch, but Nish happened to know that Louis used to be married to a local businesswoman named Beverly. Nish explains that everybody knew that Louis used to beat her and that she'd fled town to get away from him. The idea that this same man was out there with a gun and actively shooting people was keeping Nish awake at night, and he felt that someone had to do something about it. Andrew then called up a few of his sources and asked if they heard of a security guard called Louis van Schoor. They told him that they knew of him, but that no one was willing to tell Andrew anything about Louis. Thinking there might be something to this story, Andrew passed it along to one of the junior journalists at the paper, a 24-year-old named Patrick Goodenough. Patrick, it's an unfortunate name there, isn't it? Good enough. It's like not Patrick Brilliant, it's Patrick, good enough. Patrick would later explain that when he first heard the claims that Louis had shot 100 burglars, he initially thought it was bullshit. But then, in May 1989, another newspaper reported that 2 suspected burglars had been shot dead by a security guard in a local factory, and Patrick decided to investigate further. Patrick then called the owner of the factory and asked him if he knew who the security guard was. The owner then told him that the guard's name was Louis van Schoor. 10 days later, newspapers reported that 2 more burglars had been shot after they'd broken into a house. This time no one died, but the 2 burglars appeared in the local magistrate's court where they were charged with theft and breaking and entering. He seems extremely gun-happy. He's just using that license to kill that he apparently has, which is insane. One of Patrick's colleagues, Sandra Shaw, had been in court that day and had spoken to the security guard who'd apprehended the 2 burglars. His name was Louis van Schoor, and when she started fishing for a story, Louis bragged that he must have shot around 100 suspects in the course of his career. Of course, Sandra also thought that his claims were worth investigating, but when she brought it up in a meeting, the editors of the Daily Dispatch refused to run a story on such flimsy claims. I mean, yeah, don't run the story, but go and investigate it. But Patrick then went up to Sandra and told her that this wasn't the first time that he'd heard that Louis van Schoor had shot up to 100 people. Sandra then told him that the 2 burglars had claimed in court that they'd been innocent. Louis van Schoor had approached them, offered them jobs, took them to the building in question, then shot them point blank. Wait, if you're gonna do that, you would have to kill them. But Louis had claimed that they'd ganged up on him, and that he'd only been acting in self-defense, so the magistrate had taken his side and sent the 2 black men off to prison. Shocked by this new development, Patrick Goodenough started going through past reports and found around 17 different instances when Louis van Schoor had either wounded or killed a suspected burglar. All of the burglars were reported to have been black men, and whenever one of them was injured or killed, Louis claimed that he'd only acted in self-defense. They came at me. Sure they did, Louis. You psycho. Patrick then contacted Major Hayes, the communications officer at the local police station, and asked him if he knew that Louis van Schoor was out there shooting people. And Major Hayes said that yes, he was. And he asked Patrick, why are you after this guy? He does a lot of good work. Bro, it's enormously suspicious. If there's, where there's smoke, there's fire. But kind of has to be a lot of smoke. And this guy seems like he's making a lot of smoke. Like those two guys who are like, no, he said he'd got a job for us and he lured us to this place. If it was just the two guys, you'd be like, trying to get away with the crime or whatever. But I imagine it's not just those two guys, is it? Because he's out there murdering folks. Thinking they might be onto something, Patrick Goodenough contacted several security firms all over South Africa and asked them how many people their security guards shot in a year. And when he told them that they'd already confirmed that Louis van Schoor had shot at least 17 people, the security firms all agreed that it was unusual for a guard to shoot that often over a short period. Then a local businessman named Ed McFarlane contacted Patrick and told him that he needed help. McFarlane explained that 2 days earlier there'd been a shooting at a local restaurant called Mike's Tavern. His domestic worker, a black woman named Grace Sipalaw, had reason to believe that her 18-year-old son had been one of the victims, but the police were refusing to allow her to view the body. Patrick called Major Hayes to ask about the shooting, and he confirmed that yes, a security guard had shot and killed 2 black suspects at Mike's Tavern that night, but he refused to name the security guard. Good for you, Ed McFarlane, who's chasing this up. Patrick then called the owner of Mike's Tavern, who was only too happy to put Patrick in contact with the hero of the hour. And just a few minutes later, Louis himself called Patrick and confirmed that yes, he'd been there that night, but if Patrick wanted more information, he should contact the police. Patrick then found out that there hadn't been just 2 suspected burglars that night, there'd been 3, and one of them was in hospital. His name was Siyabonga Tom, and once he'd recovered from his gunshot wound, he told Patrick that on the night of the shooting, he and 2 of his friends, Grace's son Starkey and another young man called Patrick, were looking for food in the rubbish bins outside of Mike's Tavern. Then Starkey told them that the back door was unlocked, so Patrick agreed to keep watch while his friends went to see if there was anything worth taking inside the restaurant. They were still busy looking around the kitchen when they heard the gunshot that killed Patrick. They ducked into hiding places and saw a white man with a beard enter the building. He carried a torch and a pistol, and in less than a minute, he found Starkey hiding behind the fridge. The bearded man then dragged the 18-year-old boy out from behind the fridge, and Siyabonga could hear his friends screaming and yelling at the white man, telling him, "I'm sorry, my boss, please don't shoot me. Call the police." But then 2 shots rang out, and Starkey stopped shouting. Siyabonga had been hiding in a black rubbish bin, and the white man tipped it over and dragged Siyabonga out. He covered his head with his hands and was lying on his back, begging for his life, when the white man shot him in the stomach. Then the man took out his walkie-talkie and spoke into it as he waltzed out of the restaurant and into the night. Patrick Goodenough would later tell Heidi Holland that he'd been busy writing a story about the shooting when he was told that Siyabonga had been charged with housebreaking and that Patrick couldn't report on the case until Siyabonga repeated his story in court. Angry and frustrated, Patrick decided to do his best to help Siyabonga, so he approached the local branch of the Black Sash movement. They were a human rights organization which was founded in 1955 by 6 middle-class white women who actively fought against apartheid laws and human rights violations. Jesus Christ, that's brave in the 1950s. Well done, ladies. And in the 1980s, they were doing a lot of work in the black community by helping them fight back against the injustices that were being committed against them. Anyway, Patrick had a meeting with their advice coordinator, Charlene Craig, and told her all about the suspicions regarding Louis van Schoor. Then Charlene surprised Patrick by telling him that they already knew about Louis van Schoor, and then handed him a statement they'd received from a 26-year-old man called Vusumzi Kaja. In it, Vusumzi explained that in October 1988 he was approached by a white man in a bucky, which I believe is a type of van, if I'm not mistaken. I think I remember that from a previous episode, who asked him if he wanted a job. Vusumzi said yes, he was interested, and he climbed into the back of the bucky, okay, assuming it's a van or a truck of some variety. The man then drove to the Turnbull Bowling Club. When they got there, he introduced himself as Louis van Schoor, led Vusumzi to the side of the building and asked him to wait there. Louis left, and a few minutes later, he walked around the other side of the building and started shooting at Vusumzi. The bullets entered his chest and left arm. Within 10 minutes, the police and an ambulance arrived at the scene. When Vusumzi tried to tell the police what had happened, he was told to shut up, and later he'd be charged with housebreaking. He ended up spending 6 months in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. That's insane. On what evidence? What evidence? What evidence? There can't have possibly been any evidence. And Vusumzi wasn't the only one. The East London branch of the Black Sash movement had at least 3 more statements that were almost identical to Siyabonga and Vasumzi's statements, and together Patrick and Charlene approached a lawyer called David Pittman and asked if he could help them bring Louis van Schoor to justice. According to Pittman, I drove to East London, where I was joined by Charlene. We were accompanied by a relative of Siyabonga and went directly to the Frere Hospital, where we found him with a bullet wound running from his abdomen clear through to his back. Jesus Christ. A telling piece of evidence collected from the custody hospital was the clothing he had been wearing when he was shot, notably a synthetic fiber tracksuit. The tracksuit top had a gaping hole in the front, with indications that the fiber had been burned in the vicinity of the hole, which would prove Siyabonga's allegation that he'd been shot at point-blank range. Good lord, getting shot in the tummy at point-blank range? Oh, there's a lot of useful stuff in there that you don't want to get damaged. Armed with 5 statements and the evidence that they'd collected from the hospital, David Pittman and Charlene drove to the Fleet Street police station in East London in June 1989 to lay criminal charges against Louis van Schoor and to start a civil claim for damages against him. But nothing came of it. Of course it didn't. Meanwhile, Louis van Schoor had shot another black man. He was 24-year-old Mtsazima Titi, and he worked as a night watchman at a local business. One morning, he was on his way home when a tall, bearded white man approached him, pulled out a pistol, and shot him in the chest. The man then threw Titi on the back of a bakkie, where he passed out. When he regained consciousness, he was in hospital, and the police told him that he was being charged with breaking and entering. When he protested and told them he had no idea what they were talking about, they told him to shut up and he'd later be sent to prison. Again, there's no evidence. There can't be evidence because he didn't do anything. Meanwhile, Patrick Goodyear. Wait, is it Patrick Goodyear or Patrick Good Enough? That's the second. I saw the first Patrick Goodyear, Emma, and I was like, oh, maybe that's just a typo. Like an autocorrect. Patrick Good. I'm just going to look up Patrick Good Enough. Oh yeah, Patrick Good Enough is a journalist. So I think Goodyear is Emma's autocorrect being a little bit overzealous. So if I say Goodyear, it's just my bad. Meanwhile, Patrick Good Enough was making a list of all of Louis van Schoor's known crimes. Also, apparently he's quite famous because he's all over that Google front page. By August 1989, he knew of at least 5 men who'd been killed by Louis and 7 who had been wounded and then ended up in prison. But when he pitched the story to his editor, he told him that they had to wait until the case went to trial before they could report on it. In the BBC podcast, World of Secrets, journalist Dominic Jones explains that part of the reason why the editors of the Daily Dispatch refused to report on Louis van Schoor's crimes was because, at the time, the apartheid government had censored the media. They had declared that the country was in a state of emergency, and the government was doing its best not to spook its white citizens. They banned anything related to various protests, riots, and bombing attacks that were taking place all over the country. It's got to be weird. It's like, guys, I'm hearing from a lot of my mates that there are various bombs going off. And it's weird that we don't hear about this in the press, isn't it? How odd! As well as the truth regarding what the police were getting up to in the townships. And the journalists, who doggedly refused to be silenced, had a strange habit of walking into knives, jumping off balconies, or dying explosive deaths. The editors of the Daily Dispatch would have been particularly careful, since one of their editors, a white anti-apartheid activist named Donald Woods, had been forced to flee the country in 1978 after someone attempted to poison his 6-year-old daughter. According to Dominic Jones, he had witnessed the bombing of a white-owned restaurant in East London and had seen the bodies and heard the patrons scream in pain. But his editors of the Daily Dispatch refused to report on it. We could barely put a story together. Some of the columns that were being written were things like playing bridge, croquet. There wasn't a lot of coverage about the political situation. I was asked to become the port reporter, to report on the ships that were coming into port, which is rather ridiculous. The country is burning, and I'm being assigned by the editor to be their first port reporter, writing about ships. It's like, yeah, there's a war going on. It's like, what are you up to? Shipping forecast, something like that, So you can imagine Patrick Goodenough's frustration when he heard that Louis van Schoor had shot and killed a 12-year-old boy and had wounded another after it already tried to sound the alarm multiple times. Since his editors had repeatedly told him that he couldn't report on Louis van Schoor's crimes, Patrick approached Dominic Jones for help. According to Jones, quote, Patrick had gathered enough for a detailed story, but one crucial aspect remained unsolved. Had Van Schoor killed as many as it claimed? Dominic Jones needed more information, so he approached a local lawyer and asked her where he could find any information regarding a shooting that had taken place in town. She informed him that there would have been an inquest and that the files were kept at the local magistrate's court. Jones managed to gain access to the files and spent an entire day looking for anything related to Louis van Schoor. But when he found it, he was told that he couldn't make photocopies of the files, and making detailed handwritten notes would take too long. Feeling slightly defeated, Jones approached Charlene Craig at the Black Sash movement to explain that their organization was used to stealing information when they had to, so she agreed to help him. They went back to the magistrate's court, and Jones started working through the case files from 1987, 4 years after Lewis had started working at Falcon Securities, and read through them. Each case file listed the name of the victim, the date of death, the cause of death, and who was the suspected perpetrator. On the back of the file was a list of witnesses, and Jones gathered all of the case files that listed Louis van Schoor as a witness. According to Charlene, Jones would set files aside and, quote, "My job was to run up and down the staircase and manipulate the lady in the office to let me use the photocopier machine. And that was a full-time job because she was just feeling so uncomfortable, but she knew that it was probably not in her interest to not let me do it. You know at any time that you can be stopped, so you just try to outwit people around you all the time, and you know that you have limited time and you can get that information and get out as quick as you can," the quote ends. They went through hundreds of files all the way back to the early 1980s, and after 3 days, they had a list of 25 names, all people who'd been killed by Louis van Schoor. According to Dominic Jones, the evidence of Van Schoor's bloody reign had been there all the time, gathering dust. It seemed incredible that so many were dead, and yet no one had ever raised the alarm. The Vigilante Killer. It's entirely possible that, initially at least, Louis had been just doing his job, that during the early days of his career as a security guard, he had just gone to investigate the scene of possible break-ins. His contracts with his clients stated that he had to do his absolute best to protect their property, and he might have been a little overzealous in his attempts to comply with the conditions set out in those contracts. But when he described his usual modus operandi, he made each incident sound more like a hunt. Dude, again, that sounds so psycho when you're describing how it went down. It's like, and then he tried to run, and I shot him in the knees. It's like, bro, you shouldn't be describing doing your job this way. Louis explains that whenever a silent alarm would go off on the premises of one of Falcon Security's clients, he would be called to investigate. He'd get dressed in a pair of rugby shorts and a t-shirt, and then he'd drive down to the property and park his bucky some distance away so that he wouldn't alert the intruder that he was on his way. He'd collect his 9mm Parabellum pistol, his torchlight, and his handheld radio from the passenger seat, and he'd make his way to the property in question in the dark. Louis would then sneak into the building armed with his pistol and torch, and would later confirm that he didn't wear shoes during these hunts because he didn't want to make a sound. I mean, this is like crazy, but reasonable so far. I guess if his goal is to apprehend rather, like, obviously it's not, but theoretically to apprehend rather than to scare off. Like, I feel if I was a security company, I'd just be like, I'd go down there with the lights blaring like, woo, woo, or whatever you're illegally allowed to have on your security vehicles, because then people are likely to flee. And they're like, do I want them to flee? Yeah, I don't want to have an unnecessary confrontation. I don't need to catch those fucks. I just need them to know that this isn't a house you rob. He'd claimed that he relied on his senses to hunt down his quarry, explaining that he had pretty good night vision and that due to the high levels of adrenaline in their bodies, the intruders gave off a distinctive odor which helped him sniff them out. Bro, you aren't a dog. You can't smell people's fear. Wait, can dogs smell fear? Horses can smell fear, right? Once he tracked the intruder down, Louis would confront them, and when the intruder inevitably tried to run away, Louis would fire several shots at the intruder to keep them from escaping the premises. Bro, if someone's running away, you can't shoot them. If he hit his target and they collapsed, Louis would call the police, and they would come to investigate the break-in, process the scene, take Louis's statement, and bid him a good night. If the intruders were still alive, criminal charges would be laid against them. If not, an inquest would be opened, and Louis had to stand up in court and explain why his actions led to the death of a suspected criminal, which often led to any charges against him being dismissed. No harm, no foul. After all, he'd simply been following the law. Section 42 of the Criminal Procedure Act of 1977 gave members of the public the right to carry out a citizen's arrest if they came across someone who A. commits or attempts to commit an offence, and B. whom he reasonably believes to have committed any offence and to be escaping from the arrestee. Yeah, you can make a citizen's arrest, sure. I think it's a bit of a dangerous concept, but a citizen's arrest is not shooting someone in the back, is it? Section 49 then went several steps further by explaining that these private citizens also had the right to use deadly force against a suspected criminal. And I've got a quote here, which I haven't yet read, but I'm going to be very, very shocked if it allows someone to, a civilian or anyone, to shoot someone who is fleeing. Quote, If any arrestor attempts to arrest a suspect and the suspect resists the attempt or flees, or resists the attempt and flees when it is clear that an attempt to arrest him or her is being made and the suspect cannot be arrested without the use of force, the arrestor may, in order to effect the arrest, use such force as may be reasonably necessary. Section 49's insane! That could just basically be anyone who's like, oh no, I attempted to flee. I shouted out, I'm going to arrest you, and he was like, no, you're not, and he ran away, and then I shot him. Justified. Section 49, what the fuck? And then there was Section 46, which basically absolved the arrestee of any liability should it turn out that they'd performed a wrongful arrest. This is crazy, South Africa. In his mind, Louis van Schoor reasoned that it acted entirely within the law. However, Section 49 of the Criminal Procedure Act also pointed out that deadly force may only be used if A. the suspect poses a threat of serious violence to the arrestor or any other person, or B. the suspect is suspected on reasonable grounds of having committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily harm, and there are no other reasonable means of effecting the arrest, whether at that time or later. Alright, so it's not an and, it's an or. So either of these conditions have to be met. So, the suspect poses a serious threat of violence to the arrestor. I don't think that's one, because they're fleeing, so kind of by nature, they're not posing a threat. B, the suspect is suspected of having committed a crime involving the infliction or threatening of violence. No, these people aren't robbers, they're burglars. Burglars ain't committing violence against someone, they're just like going in and nicking something. I describe Section 49 as starting off insane and then turning sensible once you get into the subsections, which makes a lot of sense. It's, why laws are very specific. And to get past that unfortunate part of the law, all Louis van Schoor had to do was claim that the intruders had ganged up on him or had threatened his life with a deadly weapon, hence his use of deadly force. And because Louis was white and could prove that an alarm had gone off at the premises, the white magistrate would then take his side and the suspected intruder would be charged with breaking and entering and sent off to prison despite their claims that they'd done nothing wrong. Well, to be fair, it does seem like they had been breaking and entering, so if that's what they're going to prison for, fine. But Louis should also go to prison. I'm not saying the other dude should be let off. It's just Louis should also go to prison for a longer time. Despite the claims that they'd done nothing wrong, had been unarmed, and had already surrendered when Louis shot them. I mean, sure, but just because they got shot doesn't mean they weren't committing a crime. The case files related to his killings all noted that something has always been stolen at one of the premises Louis had been guarding, small things like clothes, food, or money. Louis's statements were always extremely vague in detail and always claimed that he fired warning shots at the fleeing intruders before he aimed his weapon in their general direction. Yet he didn't take a baton or handcuffs with him, and when he shot at the intruders, he never missed, always aimed for their torsos instead of their legs or arms, and in the years he worked as a security guard, the number of shots he'd fired at the intruders went up from just 2 to 12. In at least one case, the magistrate who heard an inquest into the deaths of one of these intruders realized that Louis's version of events didn't quite match the scant evidence that the police had collected, and he tasked the police with investigating the incident further. But of course, they all knew Louis. They knew that he was the good guy. They knew that he'd only been doing his job. He's been doing his job extremely overzealously. He'd only done what most of them would have done if they were in his shoes, and they'd been covering for him for years, so that one incident was never fully investigated. In the BBC documentary The Apartheid Killer, Louis bragged that when he started patrolling the streets of East London, the number of crimes that took place all over the city started going down. People took notice, and before long, Louis became a legend around town, and East London's white community started praising him for protecting them against the dangerous blacks. According to his daughter Sabrina, quote, "My father was very well known for protecting people. They enjoyed what he was doing. When he shot someone, they would say, 'Well done, Louis. Good job. Keep up the good work.'" You keep shooting those unarmed intruders, Louis, you legend! Because they're all racist. Jesus Christ, it's insane. His friends, his family, the people he worked for, the people he was trying to protect, they all had one thing in common. They wanted to be safe. They wanted to feel safe. They wanted to be protected. And once he shot an intruder once, he continued to do it. He had a mindset that said, I have to do this. This is what's right. He has that mindset because he's a psycho. It's not about what's right. It's about what makes him feel something. Cry the beloved country. Armed with a list of 25 possible victims and the reports from the inquest files, Patrick Goodenough and Dominic Jones approached the editors of the Daily Dispatch and once again asked for permission to write a story about Louis van Schoor's crimes. But again, the editors refused to publish the story, insisted that Louis had only been doing his job, that the magistrates had all found that the burglars he'd shot at had been in the process of committing a crime. Yeah, but they weren't. It just clearly doesn't fall into that law of them threatening violence against him or having committed a violent crime or anything like that. They were just stealing, like, some food, and Louis is like, pop, bitch. What the f***? What's more, they were funded by the very businesses that Louis van Schoor was protecting, so they told Patrick and Dominic to drop the story and return to writing about lawn bowl tournaments and bridge championships. So Dominic Jones approached the editors of the Sunday Tribune instead. Because the newspaper was based in Durban, they didn't know Louis, and they felt no loyalty toward him. Yeah, this is excellent. Good idea. They also realised that both Patrick and Dominic were onto something big, so they ran a full front-page story on Louis van Schoor's alleged crimes. It included the names of his victims, his modus operandi, the claims that he had been dragging innocent black men into buildings to frame them for crimes they had committed, and, well, all hell broke loose. I thought they had media censorship on this sort of thing. Within a few days, the story made news all over the country, and even though this was apartheid South Africa, it turned out that not everyone thought Louis's actions were justified, and it sparked a heated debate within all circles of society. Well, I can imagine every single black person is like, well, f*** that guy, and then all of the white people who are like, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be shooting random black people, because you know they're there. It's not like all the white people are crazy. Crazy. I don't want to say. I mean, I don't know. To me, racism just seems a little bit crazy. But look, they're not all like this. There are going to be some who are like, maybe we shouldn't be just shooting indiscriminately to black people. Maybe this isn't a brilliant idea. People called the police headquarters in Pretoria to scold the police for letting something like this happen, while others pointed out that according to Section 49 of the Criminal Procedure Act, Louis had acted within the law, but he hasn't. Who's interpreting the Section 49 like this? It's like, yeah, if, like, Emma presented it to me, there's the first section, you're like, ho, South Africa, and then there's the second subsections where it's like, only if this. And you're like, oh, okay, so the law's still intense, but it's not as crazy as it could be. It certainly doesn't exclude Louis. But apparently it does. Lawyers then started calling for the Criminal Procedure Act to be changed and pointed out that some laws were being used to justify the killing of a 12-year-old black boy who'd been caught stealing apples and was shot in the back when he ran away. I do not understand how that possibly falls into Section 49. Section 49 clearly has those A and B points which say, no, not okay for this. Investigation into Louis's shootings were launched, the case files were reviewed, and the debate then made its way to Parliament, where, according to Heidi Holland, quote, an opposition member of Parliament demanded to know from the Minister of Justice how it was possible for the inquest magistrate in East London to summarily close 35 inquest dockets in which one man had been implicated in each killing without a single hearing taking place. Well, you do have this interesting thing where crimes are tried separately, and often you can't consider the other crimes. Right? I've come across that before in Casual Criminalist, maybe even specifically to South Africa. But in this case, you got to be like, dude, what? Dozens of people then approached the Black Sash Movement's offices in East London and declared that they too had been victims of Louis van Schoor, a menace the black community had nicknamed Whiskers, due to his habit of sneaking up on unsuspecting black people before he attacked. Louis van Schoor's list of suspected victims continued to grow, and at one point, investigators confirmed in a news report that Louis van Schoor had shot and killed 35 black men and teenagers, most of whom had been buried in unmarked graves. According to Charlene, my office was flooded by black families who discovered for the first time what had happened to their child maybe 2 years ago. And these children had all been buried in mass graves, paupers' graves on the edge of town, and there was never any attempt by police to contact the families, and so none of them knew what had happened to their children. But Louis was unrepentant, and worse still, he kept on shooting people, killing at least one black man every 3 weeks. This dude is like f***ing serial killer, just like, but he's brazen about it. Like, not brazen like, oh, I'm going to taunt the police. Brazen like, no, it's me. I'm out there shooting all the blacks. Them, dude, they're stealing our They're stealing my apples. According to Dominic Jones, shortly after he heard that the vigilante security guard had killed another unarmed black man, Louis gave Jones a call and said, "Number 39, pal." In November 1989, just as a reminder how recently this is. That is a long time ago. But, like, 1980s. this taking place South Africa. A full investigation into Louis van Schoor's crimes was ordered, and it became the biggest murder investigation the country had ever seen. The investigation lasted up to 2 years, and it soon became clear to the investigators that the police in East London had done the bare minimum when they'd investigated Lewis's crime scenes. They didn't take photos of the victims, didn't record the scenes properly, and didn't collect crucial bits of physical evidence which left gaping holes in the state's case against Louis van Schoor. Meanwhile, Louis was forced to retire. For about 2 years, he lived the Afrikaner's version of the American dream. He bought himself a dairy farm, a few dozen dairy cows, and became a respected farmer. Then one day in 1990, 4 police vehicles arrived on the farm, informed Louis van Schoor that he was under arrest, and he was charged with 19 counts of murder, 21 counts of attempted murder, and 3 counts of assault. Excellent. Now let's see him put in prison. When the black community saw that Whiskers had finally been arrested, someone threw a petrol bomb through one of the windows in Louis van Schoor's home. Oh no! The entire building burned down, taking all of Louis' possessions as with it. Oh no! And Louis was forced to sell his dairy cows and the farm to settle his debts, which crippled him financially. One more time. Oh no! Still, Louis insisted that he was innocent, and his supporters in East London continued to insist that he was a local hero. They even went so far as to have a car sticker printed that said, "I love Louis," and drove around town with the sticker proudly displayed on their car bumpers. Sounds like a real invitation to get your car keyed, doesn't it? On the one side of the slogan, it was a picture of a smiling Louis. On the other, a red heart with 3 bullet holes in it. Bruh. I would hope your car gets keyed. A lot. And your tyres slashed. The day after Lewis's arrest, Dominic Jones wrote another article about East London's killer security guard, explaining that this behaviour is indicative of the extreme confidence and bravado that dominate his outward persona. To his everyday acquaintances, policemen, court officials, and local businessmen, many of whom hold him in awe, he plays constantly on the role of protector. Every action, from the striding walk to the macho grip on his Chesterfield cigarette, exudes absolute sureness. At times, it is almost condescending. Wow. So basically, they're saying this guy is so manly that the way he holds a cigarette makes someone feel like it's condescending. Shit. The Fall Guy. Louis van Schoor's murder trial kicked off at 9 a.m. on the 19th of August 1991. It was held at the East London Supreme Court, and it was heard by Justice Lionel Malinsky. Lewis's supporters had offered to pay his legal fees, so he was represented by the 2 most well-respected defense lawyers in the Cape Province at the time, defense attorney Johan Wessels, who had the nickname the Bulldog, and defense attorney Peter Dalberman. During the trial, Lewis's defense team argued that Louis had only been doing his job. The black men he'd shot had all been in the process of committing a crime. The laws in place permitted him to stop them by any means necessary, which included using deadly force if they attempted to attack him. He always fired warning shots, he always took care to shoot in the direction of the burglars instead of shooting at them, and all of his shootings were investigated by the police. But the prosecution argued that according to the police files and the witness statements, most of Lewis's victims had actually surrendered when they'd been shot, or they were running away, which again, unless they're committing a crime which involves violence, isn't covered by Section 49. At least, unless I'm reading that completely wrong, but it seems pretty clear-cut. That in at least 15 cases, his version of events didn't match the witness statements or the evidence collected, and that in at least 3 cases, he'd used excessive and unjustifiable force. No, that's what his whole career's about. As proof, prosecuting attorney Alfonso Hatting called almost 100 witnesses who testified against Louis van Schoor. One of them, Leo van der Skythe, was an alarm technician, and he testified that back in 1986 he'd met Louis after the latter had been called to investigate a break-in at a local butchery. The burglar had managed to escape, but Louis had been injured in the process, and he told van der Skythe that he was, quote, not going to try and arrest them anymore. The black men who'd survived their confrontations with Louis van Schoor told their versions of events to the court, explaining that Louis would tell them to surrender, and after they did, he'd still shoot them, then kick them in their wounds when they begged him to call for help. Some told the court that they'd been lured to the buildings where they'd been shot, that he'd toy with them before he shot them, and all of their stories contained obvious similarities. Yeah, like I say, there's a lot of smoke. There's a lot of smoke. But prosecutor Hatting's star witness was John, who'd been just 15 years old when Louis van Schoor had shot him and murdered his friend, the 12-year-old Lyfie Peters, back in June 1988. 12 years old. This guy is a serial killer, in my opinion. There's no justification here. This guy just likes killing people, and he likes killing children, and that's what he's doing. We shouldn't think he's any better than that. According to Lewis, he'd received a call from the control room that night to let him know that someone had broken into a local burger restaurant called Wimpy Bar, which was located on the rocky seashore. Lewis made his way to the restaurant and parked some distance away so that the lights from his vehicle wouldn't alert the intruders. He then made his way to the building on foot and entered the restaurant via the back door. There was a panel next to the door that told him exactly where the intruders were, so he took out his pistol and made his way toward the restroom. And that's when the two intruders ran out of their hiding spot. According to Lewis, one of the intruders ran toward the windows that faced the ocean, and the other charged him. He was armed with a knife and was aiming it at Lewis, intent on stabbing him, so Lewis shot him and then turned his weapon on the second intruder, who jumped through the shattered window. When Lewis turned on the lights, the first intruder's body was lying in between some tables, and the second intruder's body was lying on the rocks outside the restaurant. Lewis then called the police, who arrived within minutes and started processing the scene. The magistrate would later declare that it had been a justifiable homicide. But that's not how John remembered that night. According to John, he and Lifey had planned on robbing the Wimpy Bar. They arrived... They're not robbing it, are they? Is it closed? It was night, right? So it's probably closed, so it's a burglary, not a robbery. They arrived at night and made their way to the back of the building. Okay, there we go, which faced the ocean. Wait, the back of the building faces the ocean? What sort of commercial decision is that? Lifey used a rock to break one of the windows, and the pair quietly made their way into the dark restaurant. They were going through the tills looking for money when they noticed there's not money left in tills overnight. There's just like a float. It's going to be hardly anything. They noticed someone walking past one of the windows. The two boys ran towards the restrooms where they hid in a toilet stall, and they listened as someone entered the building. Within just a few minutes, a large white man entered the bathroom and pointed his weapon at them. John would testify in court that, quote, the white man stood outside the toilet and he said that we must come out. Lifey left the stall first and was heading toward the restaurant when Lewis shot him in the back, killing the 12-year-old boy. I saw Lifey fall. I turned and looked at the white man. I was scared that he would shoot me. I went towards him to be close to him and to hold on to him so that he wouldn't be able to shoot me. He held the gun not far from me, and then I was also shot. The first bullet entered John's leg, and he fell onto the floor. Lewis ordered him to stand up, and when he did, Lewis shot him again, this time hitting him in his left buttock. He told me to stand up again, but I couldn't. I was lying there, and he kicked me in the mouth. He told me to stand up again, but I couldn't. So he picked me up and he propped me against a table, and then he shot me again in the shoulder from the front, and I fell down. So he's intentionally just wounding him, like some psycho hunting a deer, and he doesn't want to kill the deer. John's body ended up on the rocks outside the restaurant. He had no recollection of how his body ended up there, but when the police found him, he was busy bleeding out and was rushed to the hospital. His injury reports matched his version of events, and not the statement that Lewis provided to the police. When defense attorney Wessels accused John of fabricating his version of events, John insisted that he was speaking the truth. They'd been hiding in the restroom when Louis van Schoor came across them. He had ordered them to leave the stall, and they did. They hadn't been armed, they hadn't tried to defend themselves, and yet Louis van Schoor had still murdered Lifey before using John's body as a prop to stage a scene that matched his version of events. According to Dominic Jones, quote, no matter what was thrown at him, John stuck to his story, and Van Schoor's legal team actually filed perjury charges against him. Isn't it up to the police or the judge to decide perjury, not the prosecution or the defense or whoever the fuck, the other side of the table? To counter the dozens of witness statements, Louis van Schoor's legal team did their best to prove that the witnesses were unreliable by pointing out that many of them were unsophisticated. Why is he not right? Well, he's not very sophisticated, is he? He keeps holding his fork the wrong way round. What a pleb! Unemployed, uneducated criminals from poor black communities. And he's black! How can we trust a word he says? He's black! They were dressed in cheap suits or torn and dirty clothes, barely spoke English, and according to Dominic Jones, some were prisoners, others experienced criminals. They admitted lying under oath at previous court cases, saying they had done so to avoid imprisonment. Yeah, fine, but on this time, it's like, sure, like, people lie to avoid going to prison. Like, if the charge of perjury is less than the charge of whatever the f*** you're facing, people gonna lie. But in this case, they have no reason to lie. They're on the prosecution side. The quote continues, for many, it was the first time they had told their stories to anyone in authority, and the obvious question was why they had not spoken up earlier. A subliminal case was being made for their part in some underhand and sinister plot, a malicious vendetta instigated by the slimy liberal press. But the fact was that they came and told their stories, and all were so similar. Compared to them, Louis van Schoor was an impressive figure. His greying hair was combed back, his beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore a new suit. When he addressed the all-white court, he stated, "Jury of your peers, huh?" He stated and ended each statement with "my lord," and was able to converse in both Afrikaans and English. He showed the required amount of respect and came across as humble and intelligent. And a psychologist would even testify that Louis van Schoor wasn't a psychopath, but a God-fearing, family-oriented father who'd just been doing his best to protect his community. This guy's got some top lawyers. This is a good defense right here. Other than the bit about them like, oh, they're wearing cheap suits and are black. How can we trust them? They hold their fork the wrong way. But when the prosecution started questioning him, the holes in the statements that Louis had made to the police became glaringly obvious. In one particular case, Louis had shot and killed a man called Edward Sonies. Louis claims that he'd caught Sonies in the process of stealing a car battery, and when he confronted him, Edward had turned around and started running away from him, prompting Louis to chase him down. He claimed that he'd fired a warning shot, and then fired another in the direction of Sonies, who collapsed on the ground. By the time the police arrived, Sonies was dead, but according to the autopsy report, Edward had been facing Louis van Schoor when he'd been shot. I feel like that's better for him. Like, just invents a better story. It's obviously better that he got shot in the front than in the back. The first bullet entered his stomach, and the second entered the palm of his left hand, and then made its way into his heart, killing him. Oh, I see. Sorry, I was wondering how a bullet goes up the arm and into the heart, but he probably was, like... for those of you listening, I'm holding out my hand in front of me, like my palm is out, and I imagine he put his hand out to kind of stop it, and it went through his hand and into his heart. That's 2 bullet wounds, not one, and both were located in the front of the body, not the back. The prosecution then argued that Sonies had already surrendered when he'd been shot, proving that Louis's statement to the police was false. But Louis denied this and changed his statement in court, explaining that as he was chasing Edward down, quote, "I lifted up my firearm and was in the process of firing a shot at this person when the person turned around completely as he was turning around the corner," which suggested that Edward Sonies had been running backwards when Louis had fired those 2 shots at him, which of course made total sense. Not to mention the fact that firing the second shot was overkill, as Justice Malunski would later point out, quote, "Edward Sonies had already been wounded and had no reasonable prospect of escaping. Louis had no right to kill him, and his behavior was deplorable." That's the judge saying that? Dude, you cooked. Then the prosecution told the court that the police had turned a blind eye to the fact that Louis's version of events didn't match the forensic evidence that they'd gathered. When they investigated Edward Sonies' death, the police hadn't taken any photos of the location of his body, the car he'd reportedly been breaking into, or the crime scene itself. They hadn't taken his fingerprints to confirm Louis's claims that Edward Sonies had been trying to steal a car battery when he had been shot. They didn't question Louis's use of deadly force, despite his claims that Edward Sonies had been running away from him when he'd fired 2 shots at him. And they didn't question the autopsy results when they so obviously disproved Louis's version of what had happened that night. Yeah, because they like Louis. They're like, no, he's our dude, he's our guy. He's our guy, we'll just squeeze the facts to make him look innocent. In fact, the prosecution argued that the police in East London had been complicit in Louis van Schoor's crimes by turning a blind eye whenever he shot black intruders. When discussing the claims of one of the witnesses that had been shot at a different location and had been dumped somewhere else by Louis, the prosecution asked one of the police officers why they hadn't collected bullet casings on the scene or made an effort to find any. According to the investigative officer, "At that stage, I didn't care because the person was involved in a crime. I was convinced that the man was shot on the scene. After that, I didn't look for any casings or investigate the scene as thoroughly as I should have," end quote. And despite the fact that their report stated that they'd been on the scene when Louis had shot his victims, or that they'd arrived on the scene minutes after the shootings had taken place, the police officers claimed that they couldn't remember what had happened that night and insisted that in their opinion, Louis van Schoor had done nothing wrong. But at the end of the trial, Justice Lionel Malinsky explained that he couldn't ignore the evidence that had been placed in front of him. When he read his judgment, he told the court that, "Oh, I'm sorry. I realize now. I was confused because I thought there was a jury, but then I said like all white courtroom. I just read that as all white jury for some reason, and I guess they don't have the jury system in South Africa, so it's just the judge making the decision here." Quote, "I'm satisfied that you showed no compassion or concern for your victims, that you gunned them down with a dispassionate disregard for their lives, that you needlessly resorted to the use of a firearm with appalling frequency," end quote. Initially, there had been a possibility that Louis van Schoor would have received the death penalty. But the prosecution had to drop several of the charges against Louis van Schoor due to a lack of evidence. In the end, Justice Malunski found that Louis was guilty of 7 murders. Feels like enough to get the death penalty, doesn't it? The rest of the charges against him were dropped, and in the end he was sentenced to 91 years in prison. I'll take that as a second best. I imagine South African prison is particularly unpleasant, especially for a dude who's just been murdering black people. Bro's gonna have a hard time, as he deserves. However, Justice Molunsky declared that he would serve them simultaneously, which meant that Lewis received an effective prison term of just 20 years. What the f***, Judge? Bro, you've just found him guilty of 7 murders. It's like 20 years. Oh yeah, 3 years per one, just under. Sounds about right. According to Dominic Jones, quote, "The judgment was so disappointing because the judge had decided to look at the cases individually and not the big picture of Louis van Schoor basically going out and murdering people for sport. But even the judge said in his judgment that there are many cases that were borderline, yet he still gave him a very lenient sentence. It doesn't matter how many cases were borderline, you've just said that he's guilty of 7 murders. Sentence him for 7 murders consecutively, please. How is 7 murders only 91 years anyway?" The end of apartheid. Following Louis van Schoor's sentence, the public had mixed reactions. The white community in East London still believed that Louis was innocent. Louis himself believed that he'd been selected to be the fall guy, that the apartheid government and the police force in East London in particular had just needed someone to blame for everything that happened under their rule. But according to Dominic Jones, it was East London's black community who'd really been failed by the justice system in East London. Yeah, no shit, because Dominic Jones here is correct. Quoting him, "The Van Schoor killings made me feel like we were in Nazi Germany. It was obvious that there was a problem with Louis van Schoor, but many people just went along with it. That included the police, the magistrates, the courts, and even the business community who bought Louis van Schoor's services. And it made me think, this is how Nazi Germany happened. This is how they exterminated people, and ordinary, right-thinking people went along with it because no one cared about the victims because they were a different color and not of the same social class. They were poor, and they were seen as scum who deserved to die." In an article he published not long after Louis van Schoor was sent to prison, Dominic Jones made no secret of his feelings regarding the police and the justice system's role in Louis's crime, stating that, quote, "How is it possible that a ruthless, cold-blooded murderer can commit his deeds without fear of prosecution for almost 3 years? Why did none of the police or court officials who knew Van Schoor say anything? How is it possible that 39 people were dead by the hand of one man, and the only concern came from a handful of private citizens? The police and Department of Justice continued to sidestep the issue. How do they explain it? They can't. Not unless they're prepared to admit that certain of their members and officials are guilty of racism, that prejudice from years under apartheid so clouded their judgment that they were unable to distinguish right from wrong." Then, South Africa had its very first democratic elections on the 27th of April 1994, and apartheid ended. A year later, then-President Nelson Mandela issued a partial amnesty for deserving prisoners. Whoa, Nelson, what are you doing? Which stated that prisoners who'd already served half their prison sentence and had a proven track record of good behavior would qualify for a reduction in their prison sentences. Whoa, Nelson, no! This was done in an effort to ease overcrowding in South Africa's prisons. Bro, this is the one guy who really deserves to be there. But it also meant that in October 2004, Louis van Schoor was released from prison after serving only 12 years of his 20-year sentence. So he basically got less than 2 years for each confirmed murder, not to mention all of the other ones that he probably, allegedly, in my opinion, definitely committed. Definitely committed in my opinion, I mean. Not definitely as in a statement of fact. His release wasn't widely reported on, and Louis told local journalists that he planned on getting married to wife number 5, who was a lawyer from Cape Town. He claimed that he was happy that the time has come to join society again, and claimed that he was moving to the Western Cape province, where he would run the farm his new lady love had bought for the two of them. From what I've read, that never happened. Louis wasn't allowed to leave the Eastern Cape province, and I'm not sure whether he ended up marrying the lawyer from Cape Town. What I do know is that in May of 2016, Louis van Schoor was a part owner of a multi-million rand dairy farm in East London called Kingsdale Dairy Farm. In 2011, the farm had been awarded to 3 black persons as part of a black economic empowerment scheme, and Louis was then appointed as their farm manager and mentor. He eventually became a part owner, but then someone recognised him, and news got back that he was suspected of killing more than 39 black people for sport. Probably not very happy about that. He's like, yo, Louis, I was just reading in the paper that Did you kill black people for sport? It brought up a lot of questions like how a convicted killer had managed to be approved as a mentor to previously disadvantaged black farmers, and the Department of Agriculture and Land Reform had to scramble to explain themselves to an angry public. No shit. He was eventually forced to leave the farm and ended up hiding away in a hovel on a small holding in the middle of nowhere. When the BBC released their documentary on him in July 2024, they reported that he'd suffered a heart attack in 2021 and he'd lost both of his legs as a result. Okay, I didn't know that was a thing. He was confined to a wheelchair and lived an unremarkable, lonely, sad little life. He died just days after the documentary was released. Oh no! During which time his story once again made news headlines, but once again it went mostly unnoticed by the majority of South Africans. In the BBC Africa documentary, The Apartheid Killer, 72-year-old Louis van Schoor had insisted that he wasn't a serial killer and told journalist Charlie Northcote that he just wanted to be remembered as, quote, a peaceful, loving, caring person. I want to be remembered as Louis van Schoor. Oh, you are? But not as a peaceful, loving, caring person. You're someone who shot people for sport, you f***ing psycho. And he partly got his wish, but instead of being remembered as a peaceful and caring person, he's now remembered as Louis van Schoor, the Apartheid Killer, the man who brutally murdered over 39 men and boys and needlessly shot over 100 black men for sport. That is his legacy. Dismembered appendices. Number 1. According to archive documents, Louis van Schoor murdered an estimated 41 people in total. Yet, till the day he died, Louis kept insisting that he hadn't killed them because he was a racist, and at the time, he'd been simply doing his job. Section 49 of South Africa's Criminal Procedure Act has since been amended multiple times, and arresters are no longer allowed to shoot at suspects who are fleeing the scene of a crime. But our self-defense laws have also been adapted so that you now have to prove that you're in imminent danger when you'd fatally shot an intruder. The reason for the change is because of people like Louis van Schoor. Number 3. I often like to point out that South Africa's investigative journalists are a different breed. They're fearless when it comes to exposing fraud and corruption. They've been responsible for uncovering some of the biggest news stories in South Africa's recent history, like discovering that Thabo Bester was still alive and shedding light on the Gupta family's shady business deals and their mind-boggling influence on South Africa's then president Jacob Zuma. Made a video about that on my Into the Shadows channel. It's fucking insane. I think it was called State Capture or something. And it's basically this family took over. It's wild. I do believe that's because they were forged in the fires of apartheid, the journalists that is, and that the older generations have handed that determination and grit down to the younger ones. Number 4, I recommend that you go and watch the BBC Africa documentary, The Apartheid Killer, on YouTube. You can also find the BBC podcast World of Secrets on your favourite podcast service. The documentary especially focuses a lot more on the effect that Louis's crimes had on the family of Edward Sonies, the man whose murder case helped to send Louis to prison. Number 5, at the beginning of the script, I mentioned that this is only part 1 of a 2-part series on the murderous Van Schoors. Louis's story is finished, but he's not the only killer in his family, and their crimes were also racially motivated, but not in the way you think. What is your family, dude? That's crazy. And that's where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you. Thank you, Emma, for writing it. And I'll see you in the next one.